Sheeda exhaled slowly, as she flew in a parallel line along the massive, slowly rotating hull of the sun. The near-true black surface of the enormous ship loomed ominously next to her, trickling her brain into the impression that it was somehow trying to pull her tiny little hunter into it, like a black hole or some shadowy portal. Though, obviously, that was just a literal trick of the light. Activating her frontal thrusters yet again to slow the momentum of her flight, she just barely noticed the movement on the hull next to her, as something adjusted to the now slowing movement of her cargo. A moment later, a harpoon, much like the one she herself had fired into the lump of molten material that had solidified around the still dutifully pinging black box, shot against the precious debris, latching onto it and connecting to the larger ship. With the press of a button, Sheeda's own harpoon then automatically shot off its tip before her hunter reeled in the connecting cable, as well as the remaining rod. Almost as soon as she was detached, the sun's harpoon already began to reel the black box lump in as well. It admittedly took a bit of time and finesse, but this process was still much easier than trying to somehow land with a barely controllable lump of hull slag still attached to her ship. Rubbing a hand over one of her ears, Sheeda released a mild huff before then firing her engines up again as she adjusted her course to fly around the ship and find her way into the dock. Once the slightly precarious maneuver of flying through the relatively narrow rotating tunnel that was her entrance was overcome, the feline turned her hunter onto life support mode as she sat back, since she would have to wait for the atmosphere in the dock to be reinstated before she could even think about getting out. Suddenly, a Kong came in for her, making her ears twitch as he listened up. "Please move your ship to the corner of the dock and stand by, Lieutenant Commander." The voice from her radio informed her briefly. "The dock will be needed for the landing of an urgent shuttle. Atmosphere cannot be reinstated before it has landed." Blinking slightly, Sheeda stared at her console for a moment. Shuttle? Why was there a shuttle flying around in a situation like this? Luckily, it didn't even take a full second before her brain fired up again, as she quickly reached for the button to activate her own microphone. "Copy that," she said, before quickly starting her ship up again, just enough so that she could slowly roll it into the dock's corner. Once there, she activated her microphone again. "Standing by," she announced, before heading back once again. She released a long exhale as she stared at the wall that was now right in front of her. And as she sat there with nothing to do but to think while she was surrounded by an airless room, she slowly began to feel that something was wrong. Not with the situation, no. Even if she still wondered why the hell a shuttle was dicking around out there just after an active combat situation, that wasn't what was irking her. Though, admittedly, she also didn't really know what was. Was it something about herself? Not really. She felt fine. Though after a few more moments of being alone with her thoughts, it slowly began to hit her. Why did she feel so fine? Not that she had expected to be totally broken up by a combat situation, even if it was sudden. She was trained for that much. She sure would hope that she wouldn't let it get to her too much. However, while not being too stressed out was one thing, why wasn't she angrier? The last few times she had so much as heard about an attack, she'd been absolutely livid. Blood-boilingly so. And that didn't even come close to how she had felt when she saw the victims of the attack on the detention center. But now, she was calm. They had just been attacked out of nowhere. She had been dragged into a sudden battle. So many people, both friend and foe, had died today. And she was sad about that. She felt the remorse about the people who had been killed here. She even felt the after effects of pulling the trigger herself down in her stomach. But apart from that, nothing. What was different now? Where was that fire? And more importantly, was it good or bad that it was so suddenly gone? Probably something to bring up with Dr. Nausushan once she got an opportunity to attend her next session, which should probably be quite soon, given current circumstances. It had been a while with everything that was going on, but she figured there was at least a good chance that their pleasure cruise would not be continuing after everything that had occurred. It seemed that the core worlds were even more hostile ground than they had imagined. About a quarter of an hour later, the announced shuttle had finally settled down, and all hatches were still shut while air was slowly funneled back into the room. It took maybe a minute or two more before a specialized sensor in her ship informed her, with a glowing light on her console, that the surroundings were once again breathable, meaning she could safely open her hatch. Pressing the corresponding button, the hatch of her ship sprang open, releasing a slight hiss as the seal was broken and air exchange with the outside took place, for the first time since she had closed it. Once it was open, Sheeta could already hear some commotion as a large group of people came immediately flooding into the room as soon as it was safe to do so. And once she had climbed out onto the wing of her ship, she could see that they had come bearing large bags as they hurried towards the shuttle, which was currently in the process of lowering its ramp. Resisting her urge to stand and stare to see what was going on, Sheeta climbed off the wing in order to go and properly announce her return. However, almost as soon as her feet made contact with the dock's floor, she suddenly felt how she was almost taken off her feet by another body crashing into hers, startling her so much that her claws were already coming out as her arms raised to meet her sudden tackler, though a combination of a familiar scent and breathing luckily soothed her nerves long before her aware mind could catch up to who had run into her there. Instead of sinking their claws in, her hand lay flatly down on James's broad back, as her arms wrapped around him to return his sudden hug. As she held him, she could feel that he was quite unsteady on his feet, and she subtly supported him to not lose his footing, as they embraced for a long moment. A bit of a purr started up in her chest, as she leaned her head against his. She didn't say anything, worrying that it may come off as mockery if she did, but she could feel that he had been worried about her. And although she obviously didn't like making him worry, especially since she knew how much that stung after having to worry about him way too often recently, she still couldn't deny that she always appreciated getting to feel just how much he cared about her so directly, and a warm feeling spread throughout her as her purr intensified. Though admittedly she could have done without the firm kiss he pressed onto her cheek after a moment. Still, she knew that it was an important expression of his care to him, and so she simply closed her eye on the kiss side and endured it for a moment before he finally pulled away. Looking at his reddened face, she could read right off it that he wanted to say something like, "Don't ever do that again," or anything in that vein, but obviously he also knew that she was just doing her duty, and so he held his tongue. His mouth opened a bit, presumably to say something else. However, the chaotic and from this distance, slightly incoherent shouting of the group that had rushed in earlier, now meeting with the crew of the shuttle, interrupted him, catching both of their attentions as they looked over. As they did, Sheena's eyes widened slightly when she realized what the chaotic scene she was looking at there really was. A stretcher carrying Admiral Krieger was wheeled down the shuttle's ramp, surrounded by medics and doctors working on her at all sides. Her skin was a ghostly white, far more so than even her usual pale complexion, and fully on display as the remains of her uniform were under her in tattered, cut-open rags, leaving her almost entirely exposed except for her most private area and her right leg, which had been covered with a white sheet. Every other inch of her skin seemingly had to remain free, as the medical personnel worked on it from all angles, sticking her with needles or attaching cables, tubes and electrodes to her as she was rolled along. 2 blood bags were already dripping fresh life into her at that point, and by the look of things, a third one was soon to follow. Still, the almost body horror-esque sight of the doctors trying to preserve her life was by far not the most gruesome one the scene offered. That honor belonged to her uncovered left leg, or at least, what was left of it. Sheeta's ear twitched as her concentration on the scene was briefly interrupted by a soft voice speaking right next to her. "Mama," James mumbled aghast, causing Sheeta's eyes to widen slightly. It was one of the few words from his native language that the feline actually knew. Mum. And hearing it out of James's mouth was an almost bizarre experience. James never called his mother Mum or any similar term of endearment. In fact, he made it a point not to. Granted, in this case, it was unlikely that he had consciously made the choice to do it in this case. However, the sheer fact that it would slip out of him like this spoke volumes of just how deeply the shock of seeing her in that state reached. Not that Sheeta didn't understand, of course. Familial bonds or not, the Admiral was... well, of course they both knew that she wasn't untouchable by any measure. Far from it. She was just a person like anybody else in the end. However, knowing that she could get hurt and actually seen it were 2 very different things, apparently. In the corner of her vision, she noticed how James suddenly began to move in the direction of the ongoing rescue, and she quickly jolted forwards to stop him, wrapping her arm around him firmly as she held him back from getting in the way of anything. Luckily, apart from a brief push that only lasted for as long as it took him to realize that he had been stopped, he didn't resist her, as she restrained him from approaching any further, and so the both of them just watched as the stretcher was rolled along, and ultimately out of the dock. "That was meant for me," James mumbled, clearly thinking aloud as he kept staring at the door, even after it had closed again. Immediately, Sheeta pulled him in firmer, side-hugging him as she pressed her body up to his. "She wouldn't have traded places with you if you tried to force her," she assured him, while pushing her face against his shoulder. She knew that the relationship of those two was rocky, to say the least. However, she still knew that much to be true. Whether she was the motherly type or not, if anything, the Admiral was just as stubborn as James was, especially when it came to duty. James stood frozen for a bit, seemingly not exactly knowing what to do with his feelings in his current state. Sheeta could only imagine how much ethanol was still flowing through his veins at that time, mixed with a cocktail of all kinds of different hormones and endorphins. With all of this added back and forth stress, she couldn't blame him for struggling to hold onto a single thought at that time. "Oh, James!" A new voice suddenly joined the fray, whipping both of their attentions around yet again, as even more bodies emerged from the shuttle, having presumably stood back to make room while the rescue efforts were ongoing. But now that the coast was clear, so to speak, two familiar large forms came lumbering down the shuttle's ramp. Moar and Congloarch looked rattled, to say the least. With Moar, it was understandable. She probably didn't have all too much experience of standing right next to a dying person, as every thinkable thing was done to them to keep them alive. So Sheeta wouldn't have thought twice about it, had it just been her. However, the tenacious side was a different story. His four eyes didn't scan the room or focus on different things at all. All four of them were pointed straight ahead, with only very loose-seeming focus on the people he was approaching as he walked. His mouth hung slightly open, and he seemed to push his tongue out just a little bit, while the fleshy muscle twitched up in place before settling down again, over and over, making it appear almost as if he was subtly retching. James's stormy mind seemed to immediately latch onto the possibility to focus on anything, and went right along with a wave of his usual compassion as his eyes fell onto the two giants. This time, Sheeta didn't hold him back as he hurried in their direction. "What in chaos's name happened?" he asked, once he was just a few steps away from them, though even in his now focused and concerned state, you could clearly tell from his gait that he wasn't quite all there. "Oh, James!" Moar repeated, struggling to speak, as she shuddered in place where she stood, both of her clawed hands firmly hooked into her long fur, as if clinging on for dear life. Releasing a deep groan, Congloarch shook himself so heavily that a grinding sound came from some of the plates along his body. "There was an attack," the large reptile then said, the quite obvious before shaking again. "There was an invasion." He kept describing before pausing abruptly, turning his head away as his tongue pushed itself up again, causing him to clearly struggle to suppress whatever urge overcame him at that moment. Sheeta's ears and tail sank deeply as she watched those two. She could only imagine what could have occurred to have even Congloarch so broken up, and she could see it on James's face that his heart sank just as much, even if less outward signs clearly showed it. Slowly, Sheeta began to walk up to Moar at an even pace. As she did so, she gently nudged James in the direction of the other giant while passing him, knowing that he had the better relationship to the Tenaciousite out of the two of them. Taking the hint without issue, James walked up to the enormous reptile and placed his hand on the highest part of the man he could reach, while Sheeta leaned up against Moar's plushy leg comfortingly. "It's all right," James then said softly, patting his hand against Congloarch's armored skin gently, while also leaning his face against the side of the giant's body. "You don't have to talk about it right now. You can take some time." The reactions of the two giants were very different, but at the same time equally appreciative of the soothing contact. Moar leaned down as one of her hands unclenched from her fur to reach Rashida, reciprocating the gentle touch for an innate social drive. Seemingly on instinct, her hand went right for Rashida's hair, seemingly seeking contact with fur since that is what another Raphaelite would provide, and so the old lady simply petted through Rashida's hair in gentle strokes, while the feline pressed up against her. Meanwhile, Congloarch seemed to simply relax in place as James leaned against him, making no effort to initiate any form of contact himself, as his eyes slowly closed. It even went so far that it seemed like he needed to put in a conscious effort to not lay down right then and there, which would have probably been inappropriate in the middle of a dock. In fact, all of this was probably inappropriate for this place, but sometimes what had to be done, had to be done. Still, with James being only somewhat in commission right now, Sheeta eventually felt it to be her duty to coax everyone out of the dock once she felt that things had calmed down enough to move, so they could continue this at a calmer, more private location, where the two giants could truly focus on processing everything that had happened. A gentle humming filled the air, stirring her awake as light uncomfortably shone through her twitching lids, while she struggled back and forth between a conscious and unconscious state. Though once she finally pushed herself far enough into awareness to gain control over the motion, and slowly forced her eyes fully open, even if she still had to squint heavily against the light from above, she glanced around through her blurry vision, instinctively searching for the source of the increasingly familiar sound of the hummed song. She recognized the melody. It was the Ode to Strange Suns, a very old and very famous song that first emerged back in the early days of Earth's interstellar travel, when traversing light years to reach another star system was still a daunting endeavor. It was often sung by those in the primitive ships, often called tubes, to give them hope during their bleak journey. A melancholic song about giving up your life just to see what's out there, and one day push your people so far beyond what they had once been. So far, they hadn't quite reached the lofty goal that the song set for humanity, since it spoke of mapping every star and finding eternity too short and infinitely too small for their ambitions. According to the song, the day would come when no more strange suns rise. What an idea that was. Still, even more so than the song itself, she recognized the soft voice that was humming it, and her heart lifted at the implications of hearing it. She felt soft sheets rustling underneath her head as she slowly turned her face towards the sound, and the corners of her lips slowly lifted into a smile as her eyes, which were gently tearing from the harsh light biting into them so suddenly, fell onto the scene before her. Nia sat slightly leaned against the headrest of her bed with her eyes closed, the room's white light gently playing over her dark yet soft features, as she turned her face in the Admiral's direction, while softly swaying her head to the rhythm of her humming, not moving it more than a centimetre with each tilt, so her gentle dance wouldn't interfere so much with the work of James's hands. He sat behind her with both hands behind her back, gently holding her hair, as he weaved it into long braids with practiced motions. There was a clear weakness to Nia's movements, and the way she sat strongly indicated that she likely lacked the strength to completely hold herself up on her own. And yet despite that, her humming was cheerful and content, as she had her hair braided by her brother. She seemed at peace. After simply observing the scene for a few long moments, feeling like she could get lost in the sight if she wasn't careful, Admiral Krieger then tried to push herself up a bit. However, the attempt was short-lived as a searing pain shot through her right shoulder as soon as she put any pressure onto that side of her body, forcing her to flop back down almost immediately. And as soon as she did, the pain quickly dissipated into a mellow numbness that was all too familiar to her. She was on some strong painkillers, she could tell. Therefore, if it still hurt like that when she attempted to move, moving was probably a bad idea. Not that she couldn't have borne the pain if it was necessary, however the sight of her children like that told her that it very clearly wasn't. Whatever other challenges and battles the future may have had in store for them, this was a moment of peace, and she should use it for her recovery while she still could. Meanwhile, her movement and brief hiss of pain had naturally not gone unnoticed. Once her eyes were no longer closed from the brief jolt of pain, she saw that Nia's eyes had now also opened. Her humming had stopped as the sweet girl's face lit up upon noticing that the Admiral was truly awake and had not just shifted around in her sleep. "James!" she exclaimed, trying to move so suddenly that she accidentally pulled on her own hair that was still firmly in her brother's grasp before he could react and adjust to her movements. Uncaring about the brief discomfort that surely caused, Nia excitedly lifted her hand to point at the Admiral. However, James already had a knowing look on his face. "I saw," he replied, clearly far less focused on the braiding process than his demeanor would indicate from the outside. He quickly finished up the in-process braid between his fingers and fixated it with a small golden tube-shaped clasp before letting go of Nia's hair, thus allowing her to freely move her head around again. Nia then looked over at her while James slowly stood up and moved to the corner of the room. "How are you feeling, Sophia?" Nia asked in a gentle tone that did nothing to hide her happiness, her eyes gleaming slightly in the light, as tears began to well up within them. The Admiral released a long exhale as she settled into the sheets, though her eyes never left Nia's face, apart from a very brief moment of them following James to see where he was going. Nia looked slightly messy with her hair half braided, and the light blue gown she wore all crumpled up. However, just like her earlier humming, that messiness had a certain peace to it that allowed the Admiral to relax. "Just how I look, I suspect," she replied, the smile on her face returning. "I'm glad to see you awake again." "Hey, there's my line," Nia jokingly complained with a mild chuckle that audibly got very close to shifting into a soft sob at one point. At this point, James had returned from the corner of the room, walking up to the side of Nia's bed, opposite to the one he had been sitting at previously, and with him, he had brought a large wheelchair. Briefly, he turned his head towards his mother, the look on his face rather unreadable. For a moment, his mouth twitched, and it seemed like he wanted to say something. However, ultimately, he pulled his gaze away again before anything was said. Without complaint, Nia allowed her brother to lift her out of the bed and into the wheelchair, before he slowly pushed her over to the side of the Admiral's bed. Almost immediately, once she was within reach, Nia's hand found hers, holding it gently while James was once again on the move, this time towards a bedside drawer that stood in between both of their beds. Opening it, he briefly rummaged through it before pulling out an arrangement of small items, with which he then sat down next to the Admiral as well. Leaning down, he gently reached for her face in a gesture that could have been mistaken for tenderness, had his fingers not reached to pull her lids open a bit with gentle force, right before he shone a bright light directly into her eyes. Despite the uncomfortable nature of the action, Admiral Krieger didn't resist it in any way, physically or otherwise. After he had ensured her pupils worked properly, James then gently grabbed her by her chin and moved her face around so that she looked straight ahead, which in this case meant right up to the ceiling, while he got up a bit to loom over her. "Ah," he then ordered, while holding a clear plastic tongue suppressor close to her mouth. Following the order without hesitation, the Admiral opened her mouth widely, though she forwent the actual saying of "ah" in the process. Soon enough, her tongue was uncomfortably pushed down by the plastic item, while she could see some light leaking out of her mouth in the corner of her vision. After a brief moment of inspection, the pressure was already relieved, and she could close her mouth again as James moved away from her, checking some of the monitors of devices that were attached to his mother in various ways. The Admiral couldn't help but gently chuckle at the professionalism he clearly very deliberately employed as he dealt with her waking up. It was a nice act. However, she was smart enough to know that, since he didn't call anyone in to do it, he likely had asked to conduct these precautionary examinations himself, instead of calling a doctor in for it, likely promising to call in someone more professional than himself, should he find anything actually worrying. But based on his reactions, it seemed like everything was in working order. At least the vitals she could see on the monitors herself certainly were. Not exactly healthy, of course, but also not directly concerning for someone who had just gone through the ringer like she had. Or, well, she didn't quite know how just it had been. She was admittedly a bit too groggy to fully remember the exact date and time during which the attack leaving her injured had taken place, which meant even the clock on the wall was of very little help with determining just how long she had been out for. "Do you feel anything strange?" James asked her, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Any pain? Nausea? Discomfort?" Krieger shook her head. "Nothing, apart from being high as a kite," she replied, before briefly glancing down at herself. Her body was almost completely covered by a white sheet, so she couldn't exactly see anything. However, she knew what was underneath. "Though I'm sure my leg would be in a lot of pain if I could actually feel it." In the corner of her vision, she both saw and felt Nia flinch as she was still holding her hand, her face darkening a little. James's expression also seemed to turn more serious after her jokingly said words, betraying his usually not horrible poker face. Slowly, she released a long breath. "It's gone, isn't it?" she suspected immediately. Not surprising after the state her leg had been in when she last saw it. Nia's face just turned even more glum at that. However, James sighed and nodded. "Most of it, yes," he replied honestly, knowing her well enough to cut any sort of bullshit. "Though you will be glad to hear that your usual precautions worked without a hitch. Your body accepted the prosthesis and you should be able to walk again almost immediately." She smiled. "I always told you. It pays to be prepared," she said, lifting her unoccupied arm with a finger playfully raised in lecture. Though then she moved her gaze over to Nia, reaching her already raised arm over to Nia's head and pulling her in a bit closer before gently caressing her cheek. "Come on. Why the frown?" she asked, giving a gentle smile. "You heard what he said. I'll be good as new." A returning smile fought itself through Nia's tears at the caress, and she nodded meekly, before then suddenly throwing herself forwards, out of the wheelchair, and onto the Admiral in a brazen embrace. A sharp pain once again shot through the Admiral's shoulder, as another body suddenly pressed down onto hers. However, this time she did not care a single bit, as she moved her arms around her daughter and gently petted along her back, while Nia clearly did her absolute best to suppress the quiet sobs leaving her. Meanwhile, James stood next to it all with a stoic expression, only his eyes betraying the obvious compassion he felt for his sister's happiness. Once the embrace was enjoyed, and a few soft words were exchanged, he aided Nia in getting back into the wheelchair wordlessly. And the Admiral didn't need him to say anything. The mere fact that he had decided to be here told her more than enough, even if he would likely say that he was here to visit Nia when he would be asked about it. A few moments later, the door to the room opened, with two new people entering in a visible hurry. Though despite their haste, both Tuya and Shida froze when they fully processed the scene they had barged into, with neither of them seemingly knowing if they wanted to proceed or not. Taking the decision off them, the Admiral lifted her hand and waved them closer. "Come in," she said invitingly, not at all opposed to their presence here. Not for nothing. She was more than happy with the partners that her children had found for themselves. She could hardly have wished for better ones. Still seeming a bit hesitant, the First Lieutenant and Lieutenant Commander then continued their motion, even if much slower now. James and Nia both had pretty unreadable expressions on their faces at this point, as they watched their respective partners approach. They all exchanged a long gaze with each other, which clearly told her children something that she wasn't quite privy to yet. James was finally the one to break the silence. What brilliant timing. He sighed a bit as he turned around, quickly grabbing a remote from a nearby nightstand. With it, he turned up the volume of a running but up until now muted screen that the Admiral had only been tangentially aware of so far. No, now that everyone's attention seemed to be pulled towards it, she didn't need to be a genius to realize that something important was being broadcast there. And so she got quiet and listened, her professional seriousness returning, as she fought through her slightly hazy state to not miss a detail, especially so as she saw just who the cameras were pointed towards. Leaving her enormous head to hang slightly, Apogenorana Adoxia Tuya, High Matriarch of the Zodiatos and current acting leader supreme of the GCS, had taken the stage behind what had to be a house-sized podium, even if it didn't appear like it on screen. The Admiral suppressed any feeling she had towards that vile woman, as she concentrated on listening to her words. They had seemingly missed the beginning of the conference they were not tuning into, so hopefully they hadn't missed anything important.
Firm the attack. One of the current Nafmir Duralfren, previously known as Melfahoron, used his command over several of our ships and the loyalty of crews that have been radicalized by the ongoing galactic tensions, both Seditos and Qoivery, to mount the attack. No outside influence on his actions from any third party outside of the Seditos territories has been indicated during the investigations. The black box that was discovered by the human forces and handed over to galactic investigations in full accordance to communal law and without any resistance brought some additional light to his motivations. Among the usual logs and data you would expect to find, it also contained a seemingly deliberately saved letter of devotion to none other than my own person. It seems that this tragic event turned heinous crime was something that he saw as his best chance to advance his position to that of the true Duralfren. He seemed to believe that my devotion and favour could be gained for a decisive strike against the humans, whom he believed I hated deeply, along with all other Deathworlders, it appears. It also appears that he believed this hate would go far enough that I would approve of any methods to achieve this strike against them, even an attack on not only another core world, but one of our oldest and most loyal allies. It's... She cut off briefly, releasing a distressed trumpeting sound, before reaching her trunk up to run its ends over her many dark eyes. It is, of course, hard for me, not only to have such a crime committed ostensibly in my name, but also that this seems to be an image that I have imprinted onto my people, an image of hate and discord that has radicalized them to the point that they would stoop to such levels simply to see the opposition suffer. And while it is no secret that the humans have been at odds with me, I would never approve of such a heinous attack, not only because friends of mine were lost in it too. And I am not free of blame. I see now that I was so focused on sternly defending us from the accusations posed against us, that I entirely forgot to also show the compassion that is so necessary at a time like this. And I want to apologize for this. Deeply. Even as the attack was committed by a blinded individual, the Seditos will take full responsibility for it. We are willing to pay any required reparations to each of the injured parties involved, and we deeply wish that our ties we have to those harmed can be mended, be they old or new, strong or tattered. We will gladly welcome any diplomatic outreach from the injured parties, as well as all others who are concerned, in hopes to not only aid in the recovery of our alliances, but also in the healing of our very own souls, as we will take any effort we can to move away from the hate that has caused this tragedy. Our people will not become one of violence and terror, that I swear by all three of my names. And I hope that all others follow that example, so that this tragic event may become a part of our history that will never be repeated. Now more than ever, we need to remind ourselves of the values that this galaxy was built upon. I thank each and every one of you for your attention. Success to you. Prosperity for all. Unity in the community.